Before we dive into setting up the local rigs for this head, there's some housekeeping stuff that we're going to quickly take care of that was left out of Chapter 2, and that would be the tongue and the teeth. Now we're not going to dive into the details of how to set those up because they're just FK joint chains. The teeth, I just have one joint with a control above it for the upper teeth, same for the lower, and then the tongue is just a standard FK chain with controls. So just for the sake of getting those to follow along correctly with our other major controls like head, bottom, and jaw, we're just going to parent them for now. So we want to parent teeth top to head bottom's joint. That would be this one. And teeth bottom to jaw. And tongue will also go to jaw. Again, this is just temporary. This is just for the sake of the lesson. In reality, we'd rig them and skin them and parent the actual joint chains to these joints, not the actual geometry. So let's check and make sure that's all good. Teeth and tongue, or teeth bottom and tongue should be following this. All right, and all the teeth should follow this. Good. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and create our first blend shape for this head. And to do that, we first need to zero out all our controls and duplicate off the base head geometry. If you want to be really safe, you could completely disable the skin cluster to make sure there's nothing affecting it when you duplicate it off. Also, we're going to go ahead and delete this blend shape 1 that was just left over from when we were doing a test earlier. So if you select a node down here and go to Edit, Select Node, it'll select the actual node and you can just hit delete. Okay. So I'll just leave skin cluster at 0 while I duplicate this off. Since this was a skin piece of geometry, after you duplicate it, you have to unlock all these, and then just scoot it straight up, and then turn the skin cluster back on. The reason I'm going to drag these straight up and rig all of the local rigs along the middle axis here is because we want to be able to mirror all of our skin weights over and not have to paint each side individually. If it was off to the side or just anywhere else in space that wasn't across the ZY plane, we'd have issues mirroring. So I'm going to take this guy out of the geo group and give it its own group. I'll call it local targets GRP, and I'll rename this head local miscellaneous TGT for target, and then I'll go ahead and create the base blend shape for the head. So with this guy selected, we will shift select this guy, go to create deformers, blend shape options. We will call this head base blend shape, and everything else should be fine at default. Head base blend shape is going to be the only blend shape we ever have active at all on the head base. And that's because if you activate more than one blend shape, they'll get overridden by each other. So what we're instead going to do is going to be adding a bunch of different targets, like it says head local mis target here. When we create other local rigs or just individual shapes, we're going to add them to the same blend shape as targets. Whenever you create a blend shape on a piece of geometry that also has a skin cluster or any other deformers, you're going to want to make sure that the blend shape activates before the skin cluster. Otherwise, the blend shape is going to reduce all the skin cluster deformation back to its 0 location of whatever the blend shape is. So if you select the geometry that has the blend shape node on it and right click, go to Inputs, All Inputs, you're going to want to drag your blend shape below the skin cluster so it activates first. And just to make sure that worked, let's just change this a little bit and then rotate the head, or just move any of the joints and then activate this, and it looks like it worked, so we're good with that. Alright, so like I said before, we're going to leave the lips out to do a separate local rig with, but if you look on this chart under miscellaneous local head joints, with the exception of neck shaper, since that doesn't really relate to facial rigging, we're going to go through all the rest of these to set up on this rig, and then we're going to create controls for them on the global rig and connect those, or rather have them drive the joints that we create for the local rig. So first let's start by positioning our joints. I'll just use this quick joint command I have. It's just the basic joint command. You can create it with the joint tool if you want. Bring it on up here. Let's start with the overall head joint, which we're not going to use for anything. This is just going to be the joint that balances out and normalizes with the rest of the controls, or essentially just grabs the leftover weights. It doesn't matter where you put it. I usually put it up in the cranium somewhere away from all the other stuff. Let's call this head local miscellaneous underscore head underscore BND for bind. The majority of the joints we're going to be creating here will be isolated and won't be part of a hierarchy, but some of them will. So for one that will, let's go and position our root nose joint. Maybe put it a little bit deep into the face. And align vertically with the tip of the nose. That looks good. Maybe a little bit deeper in though. Yeah. Now we're going to create a nose tip joint. This one's mainly going to be for rotating just the tip of the nose without the nostrils. So position it maybe a little less than halfway to the tip of the nose from the base. Maybe even a little farther in. Duplicate that. It's going to be a nostril. So position it vertically aligned with the nostril, as well as horizontally. Might want to push it in a little bit as well. Now to mirror this, I'm just going to temporarily parent this to either of these middle joints. And let's rename this so it gets automatically renamed when it mirrors. This will be left nostril. Go ahead and hit mirror with the same options we used before. Nope, looks like it got reset. YZ. Replace L with R. Good. Now we can unparent these. Let's go ahead and reduce the radii of these just so it's a little clearer. Okay. Next up, let's create a joint for the overall mouth. Right around there is fine. This is going to cover a broad area of influence, so it doesn't have to be too specific. Next up, we're going to create a cheek. I personally use manually created blend shapes for the actual chief puff and suck commands, but I do also just include this cheek joint right here for some extra movement for the animators. Somewhere right around there. Next, let's make one for the chin. Now all we have left are the ears. I like to use two ear joints, one for the overall ear and one for just the ear tip. You can also add one for this bulging area right here or a few around the edge. It's up to you. Now the ear tip is the one joint on this local rig here that I'm going to consciously angle so that it's easier to rotate it along more of a natural axis. So I'll just tilt it to align with the ear and be kind of at this angle. Somewhere around there is probably fine. And since I rotated it, I will freeze the transformations on it. And to mirror these ears, first let's rename them. Now let's parent the tip to the base to the head join or any of your centrally aligned ones. And then with the ear base selected, let's mirror it. And then we can unparent them. And now let's just rename our leftovers. Looks like we actually forgot to mirror this cheek, so let's do that real quick. And I believe that is it. Let's just unparent these. Alright, I think we're good to start creating controls and organizing this into some sort of a hierarchy, even though they are mostly isolated controls. Before I do anything with these guys, I'm actually going to duplicate all of these and put them in their own little group, center the pivot, and drag these straight down to the global rig. And these are going to be deleted eventually. These are really just so that we have a placement for each control that gets created. You could use some math to make sure this is exactly lined up, but it doesn't, in my experience, matter if they're absolutely pixel perfect. Alright, that looks good. Maybe a tiny bit higher. Alright, so back up in our local rig, we'll leave these guys alone for now. Up in our local rig, I'm going to create locators and groups above each of these. I have a command to do just that. You can do it manually if you want to. So for each of these hierarchies, it's going to be joint, locator with the same orientation, and group with the same orientation, with the locator transformations frozen. So these are perfect to use the connection editor to be driven by the commands, or by the controls on the global rig. So before we do anything else, let's put all these into their own group. Call it head local miscellaneous rig group. So now we're going to dive right into skinning these. Let's just make sure we didn't forget anything here. Looks good. Actually, before we do that, let's just quickly connect the hierarchy for the few that do have parents. That would just be the nose, tip, nostrils, and the ears. So let's grab the nose, tip, and nostrils. Hit up twice to grab their groups, or you could just select them over here and parent those to the nose joint. So if I were to grab this locator, they should follow along, and they should all be good on their own too. And now just grab the ear tip group and parent it to the ear, and the same for the other side. Cool, should be good. Let's start skinning. A quick way that we could grab all of these without selecting them manually is if you go up right here and make sure this is set to select by name, we can use the prefix that we've been using, head local miscellaneous, and type asterisk for anything before this point, and then head local miscellaneous, another asterisk for anything between these two texts that we're typing, and BND, because all of our joints should have ended in BND and had head local miss somewhere in them. Let's make sure it grabbed everything we needed. Looks like it did. So then just select the head and skin with the same settings as we did in the last lesson. Go in, flood everything to the head. Cool. This is going to be a lot quicker than when we painted the global head. I'm usually not going to even select vertices to flood. I'll just dive right in and start painting each of these. So right click anywhere, hit lock inverse, keep the head unlocked, and now let's say we will paint the nose first. So we're going to paint the whole nose area, and then we'll steal out of this joint when we paint the tip and the nostrils. You can use whatever settings you want here. I'll do a soft brush with replace. Actually, you know what? I'll start with a hard brush and then smooth it. Replace 100, 100. Again, we're going to be mirroring this over, so no need to worry about painting the right side. When I'm painting the nose, I like to make sure it goes beneath the nostril a little bit, so that when you move the whole nose, you don't have little nostril bits getting left over. Might actually want to go one ring further. Let's just mirror that. Smooth this a few times. See how this looks. Make sure you don't click and translate an actual joint, because that could cause some errors. I'll just hit up once and grab the locator. Not bad at all. I'll just smooth this once or twice more, and I think that'll be good. Okay, so now let's lock the head for now and move on to the tip. Keep in mind that you are going to want to balance this between the nostril, because you want the nostril to still have a nice range of influence. So maybe just nick the tip of the nostril a little bit. Oops, wrong one. Alright, looks good. Now let's paint the left nostril. We're going to lock this guy. Steal again from nose. I try to not touch the inside of the nostril, so that it's just the outer casing that gets moved with this control. And since tip is locked, we're not going to be able to steal influence from it, so feel free to kind of go out into it to make sure it covers the area. Let's test that out. Looks pretty good. Maybe a little too much right above it there. Just clean up with some smooth. Maybe add a little bit more positive to the front. Back to replace. Actually, it looks like we might have to lock nose and balance this between the tip and the nostril. Just give it a little bit more volume. Good. Mirror that over. Make sure it grabbed it correctly. Since we used mirror joints, you'll notice how the move tool looks upside down. That's because it mirrored them in such a way that if we rotate them both together, they will mirror each other. Next up, let's paint the mouth. To really quickly select the area we need to paint for the mouth, just select one of the inner verts and double click the one next to it to select an inner ring, and hit Shift period a few times to grow the selection. Grow it till it gets about halfway up the area between the upper lip and the nose, and then just start deselecting some of these outer ones. Just get it so that it nicely encompasses the mouth area. And actually just worry about the left side, because it's going to mirror over anyway. Alright, let's give this a shot. Make sure you unlock only head and mouth, because we're stealing this influence from head. Maybe a little bit more smoothing. Alright, looks good to me. A good benefit of using the gross selection method is that it also grabbed a nice area inside the mouth. It actually looks like it grabbed quite a bit too much, actually. Well, you know what? It's actually pretty good. Good for now, at least. Now let's move on to the cheek. Unlock that, lock the mouth. Start lumping in some influence around this whole area. Be a little careful when you start smoothing this, because it might start trying to trickle into the nose area and mess up some of those weights. Even though they're locked, it can be a little finicky. So I'll save beforehand just in case. It's grabbing a little too much nose, but it looks fairly stable. There's some stray weights that we could fix up later if we needed to. Mirror that over. Make sure that worked. Cool. Next up, we've just got the ears. So I will use a selection for this. I'll use the lasso. You're probably going to want to grab a little bit past the actual ear area. So I might grow the selection by 1 once I get it down. Alright, once we smooth this out, it'll probably look fine. Kind of hard to see. It's right there. Alright, lock the cheek. Flood this, seal it from the head. Alright, that looks pretty good. Now what we're going to do is lock that ear and unlock the tip and steal straight out of the ear. So make sure you also lock the head, actually. For this one, you're going to want to cut straight across just the tip of the ear, maybe loop it around a little bit. And then get rid of the excess. Flood, deselect, and smooth just a few times. Looks good to me. Cool. Now let's just mirror this over and check on it. Perfect. The last thing we need to paint is just the chin. The chin control is pretty optional, but I think it helps. So let's lock these ears, unlock the head and the chin. Make sure nothing else is unlocked. Just block it in right down here. Mirror and smooth. Good. So that's all the painting we need to do up here. Let's just do one final mirror just to make sure everything's good. So now I'm going to go ahead and create some controls and locators and groups above these proxy joints we created from earlier, or that we duplicated and brought down. First, let's change the prefix on these so that the rename process works correctly. Let's call it head global miss instead of local. Or actually, need to swap these. Let's also get rid of that 1 at the end. Okay. Let's also call this head global miss con grp. Now with all these selected, I'm going to create locators and groups and controls, first of all, above all of them with that same script from earlier. And stick them back into their group. Now let's start parenting some of these together. So we've got the ear group, or the ear tip group to the ear joint. Same on the other side. And then we're gonna grab chin, parent it to our jaw control from earlier, and all of our little nose controls to the nose base. And then we're going to parent this whole group to the head control, or the head joint. So now you're going to want to go through each of your controls and move them to a place where you can see them. I'm not going to go through this whole process on camera for you. That would be a waste of your time and mine. So instead, I'm just going to skip ahead to when I've repositioned all of these. Now that I have all of these controls, CVs moved out to a place where we can see them, we're going to go through one by one and connect these as drivers for the locators up on our local rig. So let's start with the cheek. Go to Window, General Editors, Connection Editor, and reload the driver on the left. And then select the locator here, so I'll click the joint and hit up to grab it. Reload that on the right, and then translate to translate, rotate to rotate, scale to scale. And it shouldn't move as long as your locator has all 0 values as well as your control. So let's check to make sure it worked. It did. We are good. Now to speed up this process, I have a script. I'll probably include this one since I wrote it recently. The way it works is you just select your driver, then you shift select your driven, and you just run the script and it connects the translates to translates, rotates to rotates, scale to scale. So if I were to select, say, this chin control, and then grab this locator second, and run connect all, it should have connected all of them. Good. So I'm going to go one by one and run that script on each of these. Now that everything's connected, you should be able to grab any of these controls that you created, and they should correspond to their local counterparts. And since it's all driven through a blend shape, or rather connected through a blend shape, it should work just fine being activated before the skin cluster, and then everything will be moved on top of that within the skin cluster, but should stay put within local space. Before we wrap this lesson up, let's just jump over to my finished Kayla rig to get some reference for what a more polished version of this would look like. So here in Kayla, you'll see there are a little more elaborate designs to these controls. You can create these yourself, find them online, but they work just the same as when we created them, just as NURB circles. So here we've got the chin, which follows along with the jaw, cheeks, and then you've got your ear tip, just like we created, nose, mouth. Alright, I think that is about it. And that is also it for this lesson. Next up, I'll walk you through my process for the overall eyelid area.